Well, praise the Lord. Great to be with you tonight. Thank you for being here. I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 11. We're beginning not necessarily a new study, but it is certainly, in a sense, is. And I apologize, I didn't have email all week, access to online all week, so I didn't get the PowerPoint for this service tonight to the proper people. So there is not, there were some outlines I wanted you to have, and I'm not going to have that for you on the board, on the wall rather, but so we'll just have to make do tonight. But I wanted to emphasize again tonight the idea of study. The reason we have tables, the reason we don't have the lights down low. Some churches are going to the nightclub atmosphere, darkening the lights and kind of having, and hey, that's okay, not necessarily against that. It's not a right or wrong, but we haven't moved in that direction. We moved to the direction of tables because we want you to get into the Word. And we want a study atmosphere because we believe preaching is just not one guy telling his opinion, but it's all of us getting in the Word together and allowing the Word to speak to us and change all of us. And that real preaching, when it comes down to it, is really the deal that the preacher himself is sitting in the pew or sitting at the table, and that God is speaking to all of us, and that all of us need to respond to the teaching of the Spirit of God. So that's why we have tables. That's why we've gone to this kind of atmosphere. So I want to encourage you to, and we're preaching in series. We're not just grabbing an idea here and an idea there. We're preaching in a series which gives you the opportunity of investigating and looking at and looking ahead on and studying on your own. So the reason we have the Sunday morning, we have the handouts, the messages manuscript, is because we wanted to encourage you to use that in your daily devotions and to study it all week long as well. So having said that, I want to encourage you to study with me, and what we're going to be giving you tonight may be more of a study, because we're going to kind of do we're moving into a section which goes from Matthew chapter 11 down from verse 7 down to verse 19. And as we look at this section, we're going to be giving you some outlines, and of course we're not going to be able to cover it all tonight. So we're going to begin something tonight that we're going to continue Saturday night after Saturday night until we can get it all covered. And we're going to do it bit by bit. And it'll only take us probably 10 or 12 years. It won't take us long. So we're looking at verse 7 of Matthew chapter 11, verse 7. It says, as they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. And what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I say to you, and more than a prophet. For this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there is not risen one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. But to what shall I liken this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling their companions and saying, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, but wisdom is justified by her children. Whoa, what a passage. Jesus, overwhelmed with truth. Too big to get a bite out of it. Too much to comprehend. Let it infiltrate our lives. Let it go to the depths of our minds. Let truth, which you are, literally capture us until we are people of truth. Speak to us tonight from your word, we pray thee. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You realize that the context, of course, of the passage is this fact that Jesus has sent his disciples out now to minister. So they've gone out to the cities of Galilee, and they are ministering under the power of the Spirit. He's taken the power he has within and transferred it to them, and now, as after the instruction of chapter 10, has sent them out. And while he sends them out, he goes then and begins to preach in their cities, which we believe is the cities, their hometowns. He didn't ask them to go there. He went there himself for them. And as he's preaching in these hometowns, two disciples of John the Baptist come to him, and we've talked about this. John is in prison by this time, and two of the disciples of his disciples are sent to Jesus by John. And of course, the question that they're asking in verse 3 is, are you the coming one, or do we look for another? And Jesus takes these disciples and says, well, come with me. And he took them out according to Luke, and he did phenomenal miracles. He saturated them in the moving of the kingdom, and they began to experience this with him. It wasn't just reporting miracles. It wasn't just telling them about miracles that Jesus had done. It wasn't just people standing and testifying about miracles. They were participating in this. They were there. They saw it happen. They felt the movement of the kingdom. They felt the power of God. They experienced this whole thing themselves. And in the experience of that, he said, you go back and you talk to John and tell him what's going on. And in the movement of the Spirit of God, in the aliveness of the kingdom, in the feeling of that, in the grasping of that, in the experiencing of that, they were able, I believe, to go back to John the Baptist and say, oh, it's all true. He is the one. We were there. We felt it. We saw it. You couldn't be there and experience what was going on without knowing it. And that solved that problem. Now, why was John in prison? And you've probably studied the situation yourself, but John was in prison because of Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was married to a young lady who was the daughter of an Arabian king over one of the Arab kingdoms. The reason that marriage was set up was for the purpose of aligning each other together to bring peace between the Jews and the Arabs. And so they had this marriage between Herod Antipas and this young lady. During the course of that marriage, Herod Antipas was on a trip. He was headed for Rome, probably called there by Caesar to give some reports and so forth. So as he was on his way to Rome, he decided to stop over to his brother's place, who was also a king, Philip. For the old King Herod the Great had 3 sons, and he divided his kingdom among those 3 sons. And one of them was Herod Antipas, and one was Philip. And then there was another. So Philip had a territory, and so on his way to Rome, Herod Antipas decided, I'll just stop in and see my brother on one of the coastal cities that was on the coast of Palestine. And so he stayed there for, we don't know how long, several months, whatever it was. While he was there, he had an affair with his brother's wife. Her name was Herodias. He had an affair with her, and on top of that, she was his niece, which is really an interesting factor. Anyhow, so he's had this affair with his niece, who is his brother's wife, while he's there. And they decide, well, you go on to Rome, and on your way back, you stop and pick me up, Herodias said, and I'll marry you. But if you're going to marry me, you're going to have to divorce your present wife. So he decides that will be the arrangement. Well, somehow in the midst of all of that, and you know how rumors are, somehow in the midst of that, the rumor got home to his wife that she was going to be divorced and kicked out. So she got mad, upset, and packed her bags, and she headed out. She obviously would go only have one place to go, and that would be back home to her father, who's the king over this Arab country, over this Arab nation. So she goes back home, and of course her father is mad and immediately declares war on Herod Antipas. So here's Herod Antipas. He's back home now. He's got Herodias in the palace. He has established this marriage. He's married her now and divorced his wife and married her. And in the course of this, he's now experiencing war, threat of war from without. So he's in a mess because all the pressure that would bring to you, and he's got to handle this thing and defend his country and so forth and so forth. And then in the meantime, while he's feeling all this pressure from without, there's this wild-eyed guy by the name of John the Baptist who's ranting and raving, and he's causing this spiritual stir. And listen, spiritual revival does not bring peace. It brings disruption, upset. Things get in a mess when there's revival going on. You would think when the Spirit of God comes, things would smooth out. No, war is declared and things get upset. You would think that all the problems would be solved when revival comes, but when revival comes, churches split, things happen. So maybe we don't want revival. That's a possibility. Because if you just want to keep things leveled out, revival isn't the thing to have. But anyhow, John the Baptist is preaching, and over a 6-month period, you got this phenomenal revival taking place, and there's this sweeping move of the Spirit of God, and people are lining up and confessing their sins, and John, of course, is hot and heavy on this thing. And then one day the king shows up, Herod Antipas, comes to attend one of the services, and John the Baptist just goes after him. He's in his face, and can you see him? There's this Jordan River, and of course John the Baptist is like a wild man, and he leaps over the Jordan River, stomps down through, comes up the shore, gets right in the chariot with the king, which is not a good thing to do. He's got his secret police there and all that. And he's in the face, puts his finger right on the nose of the king and says, "I'm talking to you, son. Get rid of that woman. Send her back to her husband. You shouldn't be married to her anyhow. Send her back to your brother. You are committing adultery, and God's going to get you." Well, that didn't set too well. And if it would just been one service, you know, that could be handled. I suppose you could say, well, he just had a bad day, probably ate pizza that night before he went to bed and was a little upset. But it wasn't just one service. He just wouldn't get off the subject, and he kept talking to the people about it. And it was like, wow, constantly blaring. And you got a king who isn't living like he ought to. And, you know, he just went after it. And so the people were getting stirred up because they wanted revival, and they realized if their king wasn't right, that this whole thing was in a chaos. And so there was a stir going on against Herod Antipas. So can you get the feel of this? You've got all of this pressure from without, which is a war thing. He's being threatened with war from without, and there's just internal revolt going on over his present marriage situation, and he's in a mess on that thing. And see, sin is costly, folks. Sin is very costly. And so he's got all of this upset in his life. So he doesn't know what to do, but he knows he's got to shut the mouth of John the Baptist. Now, he's got enough sense to know that John is a prophet because he's heard that, and he would believe that himself, no doubt. So he decides, I don't want to kill John the Baptist. I got to shut the boy up. So the only thing he knows to do is he sends his men out and captures John the Baptist and puts him in a dungeon cell. Well, obviously, John isn't going to do any preaching. The revolt is going to stop. The publicity of this marriage is going to settle down, and things are going to get back to normal here because I've shut the mouth of John the Baptist. And the scripture says, of all the sins, you can read this, I think it's in Luke, of all the sins that Herod Antipas committed, on top of the top one, the most severe, he added to that, the worst of all, he shut the mouth of John the Baptist. Well, adultery is bad. That's right. Alcoholism is bad. Absolutely. Drug addiction is bad. Absolutely. Swearing is wrong. Absolutely. You can just go right down the line and name all the sins. Lying, cheating, stealing. They're all bad. That's right. But the worst of all, the Scripture says, the worst of all is when you silence the speaking of God to your life. When you take the mouth of the Holy Spirit and you jam it shut. When you close your ears and harden your heart and refuse to listen. That becomes the worst of all of it. Because somehow when that takes place, there is no hope. When you quit listening, when you quit responding, when you quit allowing God to speak to you, how are you going to know the truth? And Herod Antipas reached out and shut the mouth of John the Baptist and put him in this dungeon cell. So at this time, John the Baptist is in this dungeon cell. Now you know there's going to be a birthday party, and in a drunken fit, he's going to promise Herodias, his wife at this time, anything she wants if her daughter, teenage daughter, will dance for them. And she's going to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So he doesn't want to kill John, but he doesn't have any choice because he promised. Isn't that interesting? You can commit adultery, but you can't break your promises. That's an interesting ethic, isn't it? Anyhow, that's the situation of the passage. That you've got John the Baptist who's now in a dungeon cell, and Herod Antipas is in this position of having shut the mouth of John the Baptist. You would wonder who would come to the defense of John the Baptist. You realize the leaders of Israel had phenomenal power. We see that demonstrated, for instance, in the whole Pilate scene. They actually had Pilate, a Roman governor, who would be something of almost equal to who Herod Antipas was. They had Pilate under their thumb and could blackmail him and back him into a corner and get anything. The power of the country was in the hands of these leaders of Israel, the Sanhedrin. You would think with a sweeping revival going on, you would think with the movement of God taking place, you would think with the prophet, a prophet appearing again after 400 years, you would think that in all of that movement of the Spirit of God, the leaders of Israel would jump on board with that thing. And in getting on board with the movement of God, they would have come to John the Baptist's defense. And with their political power and pull, you would have thought they would have come right to Herod Antipas, and they would put him in his place and got a release of John the Baptist so he could have come back to his pulpit and led the revival. You would have thought that would have taken place. But it didn't. In fact, underneath it all, the leadership of Israel was really wanting to get rid of John the Baptist after all. But they couldn't touch him because of the people. And now Herod Antipas has solved their problem for them. And they're glad. So who is going to stand up for John the Baptist? Who is going to defend him? Now, another view of this is, not only have you got John the Baptist in prison and there's these rumors going around because why is he in prison and what has he done and what is the problem and what's happening? Who's going to defend him? But you've got the fact that he's asking two of his disciples to come and ask the question, are you really the coming one or do we look for another? In other words, is he having doubts? And if you were looking at that, would you not say, well, maybe John isn't as steady on this thing as we thought? Maybe he isn't as focused as we once thought he was. Maybe he isn't as determined in this whole thing as we anticipated. So maybe we're going to have some doubt. So who's going to come to the defense of John the Baptist and say, wait a minute, that's not what he's asking. He's not doubting in that sense, and we've walked through that material. He's not doubting in that sense. So who is it that's going to come and defend? Who's going to be your defense in the midst of crisis? In fact, if you had a choice, who would you like to defend you when the questions are raised about character, when questions are raised in the community, when questions are raised about integrity, when questions, who do you want to come to your defense? I think it's phenomenal. Jesus says, I will defend you. And the one who's going to come to John the Baptist's defense is Jesus. And we don't have time tonight to go through story after story after story after story of the great saints of the past who absolutely would not defend themselves. And when accusations were made, and when they're called in before the court, they kept their mouths shut and refused to defend themselves. Because they had one defense, and that was him. Would you be willing to let Jesus defend you? And would that be enough for you? I struggle with that. Because I feel like I got to speak my piece. I got to say, hey, wait a minute. Would it be enough for my defense to be Jesus? So Jesus is going to defend him. Now the section we're dealing with here is the defense that Jesus gives. And it's divided into 3 sections. So if you follow this outline, you've got the defense, and the first section of this is verse 7 and 8, which is the statement of Jesus defending John the Baptist. And we're calling verse 7 and 8 John's personal integrity. So the first thing Jesus goes after in relationship to John the Baptist in defending him is a bold statement to the multitude, you'll see in verse 7. And then as you get into this study, as you go down towards the end of the section, which is verse 18 and 19, you realize he begins to shift into discussing this or addressing the leadership of Israel. So as he starts with the multitude and then moves to the leadership of Israel, the first section is the integrity. He calls upon the integrity, validates the integrity of John the Baptist. So it's John's personal integrity, verse 7 and 8. Then in verse 9 and 10 and 11, Jesus goes after John's prophetic instruction and calls upon John as a great prophet. In fact, the last of the prophets, in fact, more than a prophet, he says. So verse 7 and 8 is John's personal integrity. In verse 9 through 11, you've got John's prophetic instruction. And then verse 12 down through verse 19, you've got John's prominent intensity, which is a whole other section we want to deal with. Now, we want to start tonight with verse 7 and 8, and I want to read it again. As they departed, Jesus began to say to the multitudes concerning John, "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft garments? Indeed, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses." John's personal integrity. Now we're going to break this into 3 parts, and I have no idea how far we're going to get tonight. Looks like we're not going to get very far. John's personal integrity. And we're going to break this into 3 parts. First of all, in verse 7, he addresses the idea of John continued in truth. In verse 8, he addresses the concept that John was clothed in truth. He continued in truth, verse 7. He was clothed in truth, verse 8. And John's content of truth in verse 8 as well. Let's look again at verse 7. John continued in truth. Now, Jesus is defending John the Baptist to the multitudes. And he's talking to them distinctly and directly about John. And he says, "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind." Now, first of all, you've got to grasp the concept that Jesus is not condemning here. So you can't, at first I walked into this passage and thought Jesus was condemning reed weeds. He's condemning people who live in who wear soft clothing. He's condemning kings in their palaces who have it soft. He's condemning prosperity. He's going after that stuff. That's not what he's doing. Get that clear out of your mind. He has I don't believe there's any attempt, as you get at the heart of this passage, that there's no attempt in this passage to criticize, to undermine, to belittle kings, the political system, king's houses, comfortable living, soft clothing. He's not talking about that at all. That's not the purpose. He's instructing here because this is a defense. He's talking to you about John. And he's saying, hey guys, you went out into the wilderness, and he asked this question. What did you go into the wilderness to see? What attracted you to go out there? What drew you out there? Why would you go out there? In fact, the Greek word for to see is the word where we get our English word theater from, which has to do with entertainment, has to do with something attracting me. I go out to watch something, to be amazed, to wonder at something. So he said, what was it in the wilderness? Did you go out to see the bugs? Well, I mean, what was spectacular in the wilderness that would draw you to go out there in the dirt, go clear out there where there's no water? Why would you go out there in the wilderness? I mean, did you go because there was a beach? Oh, come on. What drew you out there? He said, I'll tell you what drew you out there. It was one man. It was one single man. That's what drew you out there. And this one man, the reason you were drawn out there by him is not because he was it was a fashion parade. It wasn't because, well, he's one of the 10 best dressed men in Israel. It's not that, because you've read the description of how he dressed. Matthew gives it to us in chapter 3. He says, John himself was clothed with camel's hair with a leather belt around his waist. So this was not a fashion thing. You didn't go out there to align yourself with high fashion. That's not what allured you out. Why did you go out there? Did you go out there because, oh, John's a gourmet cook. He's been on the food channel. Yeah. We're going out there to eat buffet. Is that why you went out there? No, because again, he describes the eating habits of John. His food was locusts and wild honey, which is pretty steady. So obviously you didn't go out there for the purpose of food. You didn't go out there for the purpose of fashion. What was it about John that drew you out there? What was happening in this whole thing that would get you to go to a place where you would never go if it hadn't been for this one man and something was going on in him? He says, I'll tell you what drew you out there. And it is the fact of, into verse 7, a reed weed shaken by the wind. John was, see, it's a rhetorical question. John was not a reed weed shaken by the wind. A reed was the weeds that just grew along the banks of the Jordan River. It was what he's referring to as the stalk of the reed weed. And it was just so flexible. It was so flimsy and flexible. When the breeze would come, it would just bend. It never broke. You just bent. Whatever the breeze went, however the wind blew, it went with it. And it would just go in the breeze. He said, do you think John was that kind of a guy? Do you think that's the way he approached life? Let me tell you, you know better than that. There's something about John, he said, that was so consistent. There's something about John that was so solid. I'm not talking stubborn. There's something about John that was so dead on. There's something about John that was just would not give up. There's something about John the Baptist that was just so latch on to it and wouldn't turn it loose, was unbendable on some things. He was not a reed weed. He consistently, constantly continued in the truth, which is what he's trying to tell us in verse 7. Let me give you 4 ideas in connection with that. He continued in the truth in his call. I was really intrigued with this. If you go back to Luke chapter 1, you will discover that John the Baptist was filled with the Spirit from his birth all the way up. And the significance of that, according to the prophecy that was given at his birth, was there was this phenomenal call that was upon the life of John the Baptist. This was not a guy who's graduated from college and is looking at himself saying, well, what am I going to do with my life? This is a guy who's known what he's going to do from his birth all the way up. It was implanted within him. There was a call that came to him to be the forerunner of the Messiah. There was a destiny. Do you realize how strong that was in John's life? See, John's dad was a priest, which meant he was of the tribe of Levi, which meant that John should be a priest. On top of that, his mother was of the tribe of Levi, which meant from both sides, he was absolutely destined to be a priest. Because if you were born into the tribe of Levi, that was your calling. And John, can you imagine the pressure? Oh, another priest has been born. Can you imagine the pressure that John felt growing up? Oh, you're going to be like your dad, aren't you? Another priest. No, I'm not. What are you going to be? I'm going to be this hairy guy wearing camel skin out on the Jordan River, the banks of the Jordan River, yelling and screaming and getting everybody stirred up. I'm going to be a prophet. Well, we haven't seen a prophet for 40 years, but this is my calling. My calling is to be a forerunner, and he would not get off of that. His calling was so strong, his sight was so set, he was so consistent in what God had placed upon him from childhood all the way through. You never see one single incident in his life where he wavered on that thing. It was absolutely down to it consistent in his living. Wish I could say that. I know you're thinking, well, how does that apply to my life? How does that apply to your life? John had a call when he was born. I think you had a call when you were born. I believe tonight that God had a distinct purpose for your life at your birth. I do not think you are an accident. I cannot no, there is no way I would ever agree with, oh, you just happened and we wish you were a mistake. I believe that God, or if you go according to the scriptures and the plan of God, you read Psalms 139 that God was back in my mother's womb and he was mixing up my chemicals. That he was taking, oh, I got to have a little of that. Oh, I want a little of that. Oh, I got to ask, I've never made of a guy like this. Oh, this is something. And God was putting you together for distinct destiny and purpose. That God had a plan and a dream and a calling for your life from the very beginning. That you are not here by accident. This is on purpose. And you have a distinct destiny planted on you by a divine God. And that's been upon your life from birth all the way to this moment. And what God has been trying to do in your life from the beginning to this moment is, oh, would you please get in the middle of the plan? Well, I am not happy. Well, how could you be if you're not in the plan? Well, I've done this, I've done that, I've gone there, I've gone here, and I just don't feel like, well, how could you feel like anything was of value if you didn't find the fulfillment of the destiny and the call of God that he put you together for? How could I reach out and grab a hold of you and just pull you into the overwhelming dream of God for your life? Don't miss that. I'm begging you. Do not miss that. Well, you say, I don't know what it is. Well, go after it until you do know what it is. I mean, seek that out. Go after the divine will. Seek that out. There is a call of God upon your life. Well, is it full-time ministry? It may be. But what we call full-time ministry. But it may not be. But is there anything but full-time ministry? I mean, come on. When you're into Him, what else is there? I mean, and when He's into you, what else is there? I mean, isn't this a dream that God wants to fulfill in your life? And John would never, ever, he just wouldn't. He could have been a priest, worn the big robes, had the tassels. He could have fit into the cultural acceptance of his world, and he would not bend on that thing. There was a call of God, and he was steadfast in that. Whew. I urge you to find the call of God in your life. I urge you to find the dream and fulfill that dream. So Jesus is saying, I want to tell you about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? Absolutely not, because John was consistent. He was steadfast. He was locked on. He was unmovable in some things. And one thing he was unmovable was his call. Let me give you a second. His category. He was unmovable in his category. You see, this call was all wrapped up in being a prophet. Can you imagine? For 400 years, there hasn't been a prophet. And John the Baptist shows up. He's the first one in 400 years. Wouldn't that have been something? Well, how would he know how to act? I don't know. How does a prophet act? Where's the school of the prophets? Where do I go to? How does a prophet live? What does a prophet do? There's the Old Testament, of course, and you can glean some things from that. But when it comes down to it, that's ancient, 400 years ago. You know, in another culture with another flow and a different kind of society. And here we are now in this present hour with John the Baptist. And how am I supposed to act? And what does a prophet do? And how do I approach these people? And all the ins and outs of being a prophet. What would that be like? Who's going to train him? What's going to be the focus? What's going to be his message? And isn't it interesting? He, as a prophet, had one single focus. One single focus. His whole prophecy. And he could have gone after the Isaiah and the Jeremiah thing, and he could have gone after the prophets of old and duplicated their messages, but he did not. He was focused, locked in, steadfast, absolutely saw one single prophetic message to give, and that was, the kingdom is here. The kingdom is here. In fact, right over there is the king. And he would not get off of the message of Jesus. Man, I like that. Well, you say, what does that have to do with me? Wouldn't it be interesting if embedded within the call that God has brought to your life, embedded in that is a focus on Jesus? Wouldn't it be interesting if a large part of the essence of the dream of God being fulfilled in your life is this absolute focus on the person of Jesus, until he's the essence of your talk, and he's the motivation of your being, and he's the one who's captured you in your dreams, and he's the one you eat and sleep and drink and live and breathe, and your whole life is somehow all wrapped up in the fulfillment of who he is through you, which fulfills the call. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that simplify things? Because this is not about talent, and this is not about ability. This is about a focus on Jesus that becomes so strong. And John was into that. he didn't do anything but just point people in the direction of Jesus. Just be prepared. His whole ministry and as a prophet was all wrapped up in getting people ready for the coming Messiah who is here. The kingdom has arrived. Will you get in on this? Well, let me give you another one. Not only his call. See, Jesus is defending John the Baptist, and he's defending him in his personal integrity. And one of the strong aspects of his personal integrity is this: he continued in truth. And a part of that continuing truth is, first of all, his call, second of all, his category, thirdly, his concentration. Already given it away. His whole concentration is this Messiah. This Jesus. He is so focused on Jesus. This blows me away, and I've thought a lot about this. The whole idea that they came up to him, the leaders of Israel, and said, "Are you the Christ? John, are you the Christ?" You know what I would have said? Well, close to it. You know, let them think that for a little while. Why not? Wouldn't pride come up? You've talked to us so much about the Messiah, and you're so different, and are you the Jesus that we're looking for? Wouldn't it just be, he absolutely would not even tolerate such a thought in his mind. He was constantly saying stuff about, oh, he must increase, I must decrease. Oh, I'm not even worthy to handle the feet stuff concerning this guy. He is so far above me. Yeah, I take some water and throw it on you, man. But this Messiah person, oh, do you understand? He's going to baptize you in the Holy Spirit and in fire. And he is in such a state so far above me. I'm not even hardly worthy to come into his presence. Don't you understand? And his whole message constantly was a promotion and a focus on and a lifting up of and a pointing to and literally shoving people, even his disciples. He said, listen, don't follow me anymore. Go after him, man. Go after him. Who in that? I mean, can you imagine in the Church of the Nazarene getting up on Sunday morning saying to your people, go to the Baptist church? No, it isn't going to happen. But here's the Baptist saying, go to the Nazarene. That's what the Baptists were doing. Mercy. That's radical, isn't it? That's mind-boggling. That John would begin to sin because he believed in this so much. This was such a focus that, see, what would you do to get people into Jesus? How far would you go? What would you give? One of the fundamentals of a practical ministry school that we keep talking about is that ministry is not in this motion. Ministry is in this motion. That somehow what we're being taught is that I'm coming to Lebanon, Tennessee to pastor the Church of the Nazarene. Oh, the Church of the Nazarene. Oh, the Church of the Nazarene. Oh, how many people do I have? Oh, what's the parsonage like? Oh, what's the youth group? Oh, how many teenagers? Ah, what's the children's program? Oh, how are we going to? What are we going to? And it's all right here with our little, we're going to make plans for our. What would happen if you came to pastor the Church of the Nazarene and you became the pastor of the community? That's an awesome thought. How are we going to win the community? How are we going to infiltrate? How are we going to move upon? How are we going to get into how are we going to go into the high school? How are we going to? And do you realize there is an overwhelming risk that you might spend all this money and do all of this work and they may never come here to this building? Wouldn't that be awful? I mean, isn't this building the entrance to the kingdom? Isn't this the heavenly gate? See, John the Baptist said, hey, he was so focused on Jesus and so wrapped up in the Messiah that his concentration was so strong that pride couldn't erode that. He lived in that concentration. Let me give you one more. His content. John the Baptist, Jesus is defending him. It's his personal integrity. And the first aspect of his personal integrity that he talks about is that he has this consistency, this constant element in his life that just is unmovable. Every time you meet the man, it seems like he's always on that same page. Every time he talks to you, it seems like he brings up the same subject. This guy is so consistent. He's consistent in his call because he wouldn't let anything distract him from the call of God that he had from his birth all the way up. He was consistent in his category. He was a prophet. He wouldn't let the old-time prophets shape his view. He had one single thing to focus on in his prophecy. His concentration was absolutely unbendable. He was so concentrated on the Messiah that even his pride couldn't pull him away from that. And now he's consistent in his content. His message was always the same. I was really intrigued by this. And in some sense, we've talked about this at other times, but when you go over, and you don't need to go there, but in Luke, Luke gives you more of the message of John. The general populace, that is the general people, they came and said, well, John, we're under conviction, and what do you recommend for us? And John said, he who has 2 tunics, let him give to him who has none. And he who has food, let him do likewise. Why should we do that, John? That would be the way to be prepared for the coming of the Messiah. You're stepping into the flow of the kingdom when you do that, guys. So if you're really repenting, people, and you really want to get on board with the coming kingdom and where we're going with this thing, he says, here's what I want you to do. If you've got 2 tunics, give to him who has none. And if you have food, hey, divide it up. The tax collectors came. Oh, this is good. He's going to give another message to them. They came and they said, well, what about us? John said, collect no more than what is appointed for you. Well, that's the same message. Hey, quit cheating the public. The soldiers came along. Guess what he had to say to them? What shall we do? They said, do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with your wages. What? Never! Isn't that an interesting message? And then the Pharisees came along. And in Matthew chapter 3, verse 9, he began to talk to them about what the same message. And what was the message? Don't say we are the children of Abraham, but God is able to raise up stones from the children of Abraham from stones. If you're a child of Abraham, you're not any higher than a stone, man. Why? Because the kingdom, don't you understand? The kingdom is about others and the outspill. And Herod Antipas comes on the scene. Can you see that scene? I can see John getting ready for his Sunday morning message, and the head usher runs over and says, oh, John, the king just pulled up in his chariot. Oh, that chariot is gold-plated. Oh, the horses are stunning. Oh, John, the king has come. He's on the front seat. John, comb your hair, please, comb your hair. And stand in one spot. Oh, please, don't jump around today, please. And try to say something decent. Stick to the outline, will you, John? John says, okay. So he combs his hair. John comes out, tries to plant his feet so he doesn't move. He gets right in the middle of his message, and I don't know. Something just happens to the old boy. Off he takes, man. He's down there. He's oh no, he just jumped the Jordan River. Good night. Oh, he's in the face of the king. Just couldn't get off the message. King, you need to line up for the kingdom too. He's just so consistent in this. What's going to win your kids? What's going to impress them? What are people going to remember about you? I'm deader than a doornail, laid out in a casket. Everybody gathers around. Manley was a fisherman, wasn't he? What are we going to do with all those reels? Really loved to fish. He could catch them. Is that bad? No. Everybody gathers around. Manley was a hunter, wasn't he? Man, we got guns. Oh, do we have guns? What are we going to do with all those guns now that he's gone? He could catch them. Is that all they're going to get? Wouldn't it be something if they'd gather around and say, Manley was a fisherman. Yeah, he won more people fishing than you can shake a stick at. He'd get them out in a boat. Where are they going to go, you know? He had them. See, there's nothing wrong with fishing. Are you getting this? See, that's what Jesus is saying in the passage. This isn't about soft clothes are bad. He's talking about focus here, and he's talking about a consistency, and he's talking about, see, what is it that you're going to leave us with? What is so consistent in your life that every time we come up, we know how you're going to react. We know how you're going to respond. We know what you're going to say before we ask you. When we see you on Monday, it's going to be the same thing you say on Tuesday. And when we meet you on Thursday, good night, you're just like you are on Friday night. I mean, doesn't matter when we come, you have a consistency about you, which is isn't that the fruit of the Spirit, which is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control? Isn't that the kind of thing the Spirit of God does within an individual, which just somehow is so... Should He produce that in my life? Jesus, could you so capture me the consistency of your presence and the flow of your life in me? Would always be the same. God, forgive me when there's moments people don't want to talk to me because I'm in a rage. Forgive me, oh God. When people say, well, he's in a bad mood today. Lord, you know I'm not able to pull this off. I can't get this done in my life. That I don't have enough self-discipline and I don't have enough ability to lock myself in and make myself. The only chance I've got is for you to absolutely capture me. Until through my life there's the consistency of your love, the consistency of your joy, the consistency of your faithfulness, the consistency of your long suffering, the consistency of your control. Please, Jesus, give me that. Give me that.